Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we are changing the mental health narrative, bringing hope and solutions. Here's your host, Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist.
Jeff Sucec is principal and co-founder of Performance Potential Incorporated. He has over 40 years' experience working with a wide range of organizations, helping them move to the next level of performance. He's a thought leader in the alignment of business goals and strategy to employee productivity. Jeff is often the highest-rated keynote speaker at business conferences. The topics he covers includes leadership, employee engagement, using innovative approaches for maximizing performance, identifying and migrating best practices, creating a culture of creativity and innovation, and implementing client-focused sales cultures. He's a published writer in organizational behavior, performance improvement, and sales management effectiveness. Well, Jeff, thank you for being here this morning. It's delightful to see you face to face.
Well, Tim, it's truly a pleasure, and I really am very respectful of the kind of work that you do, and I'm sure it touches the lives of many people in meaningful ways. So first, congratulations to you and a lot of your efforts.
Thank you. I was hoping you could let us know, from your perspective, how things have moved from just viewing the person in the workplace as a cog in a machine to viewing that person as a whole person with a variety of needs, and how that's related to productivity today.
Well, I think that's a great opening framework, because a lot of times when people ask, well, what are you doing now in terms of to maximize someone's productivity? I think it's really good to have a context, because you could almost talk about in a kaleidoscopic way the history of human motivation in the workplace in about 3 minutes. And it's really four kind of substantive evolutionary buckets. The first one really had to be with looking from a perspective of left to their own devices, the worker will be unproductive because they'll be inherently lazy. So the leader has to hover over them. And then there was an evolutionary flow that basically said, no, what I have to do is make the worker satisfied. So I gave them a lot of things non-contingently, hoping that a satisfied worker would lead to a productive worker. And then there was a realization that, no, I think what we really need to do is view things from a behavioral perspective of we're renting a set of behaviors on the job. So I have to create an environment conducive to high levels of performance. And my role is strictly defined in terms of those on-the-job behaviors, not necessarily the mind and how individuals think. Now, what's really happened, and I think it's very refreshing, is there's a realization that we need to look at the whole person, that what they bring to the job and what they have at home and in other settings is all germane to their productivity. So it's just not renting behaviors. You're looking at their thoughts, their attitudes, their motivations, their emotional states. And we kind of have to look at the whole individual if we're really going to be fair to them and be representative of what really they're bringing to the workforce on a day-to-day basis. So that's kind of why I was trained more as in the behavioral psychology realm, and did a lot of work in there and saying, well, the only thing that is relevant is what we see is in terms of overt manifestations of what's inside. But now we realize, no, you better do a deeper dive in terms of that whole framework of an individual.
Well, and so how long have you been working in the field?
Well, I started undergraduate work in behavioral and experimental and learning and motivational psychology. And then it was a deep passion of mine to understand human behavior. You know what maximizes productivity? Why are there, people who plateau? What about variability? What about regression? And so I did graduate work in organizational behavior and also in business. And so I started in the consulting field a little bit over 40 years ago, in terms of what do we do to maximize performance using a variety of techniques. So it started as an undergraduate passion in psychology, and it manifested toward a little bit over 40 years now in terms of consulting.
And so how long ago would you say you personally were introduced to the switch to looking at the whole person?
Well, this is kind of fascinating, and I believe at some point we'll talk about synchronicity, if you will. And I think it's overtly doing that versus knowing what you're doing behind the scenes and realize it's always been a passion. So if you see the variety of books behind me, it's always a wide variety of business-related books and an equal number of personal transformation books. So many years ago, I started following Jon Kabat-Zinn and Wherever You Go, There You Are, or Full Catastrophic Living, where he started to look about the effects of meditation on cancer patients and realizing that the ones that meditate had a greater chance of recovery. So I started to read those books and not assimilate them into my consulting until about 20 years ago. I realized, wow, these are the kinds of things that need to be fully integrated to really talk about higher level leadership and how to really maximize performance. So I started the integration process from the behavioral approach to the whole person, maybe 20, 22 years ago.
Wonderful. And of course, applying that in your own life and having that kind of as an undercurrent to what you're doing, you were probably implementing some of those things even before 20 years ago.
Well, I think so, from the perspective of if you, and that's very fascinating that you would say that, because independent of that, I thought, well, for stress reduction techniques, I find different ways of meditating or breathing exercises or slowing down so you're not always a type A kind of individual. So I try to use those things independently for personal transformation, and reading a wide variety of, authors that you would rattle off to, like the Deepak Chopras and the Wayne Dyer individuals and the Michael Singers and Jon Kabat-Zinn, and looking at all of those people for personal transformation and realizing a light bulb going on and saying, oh, wow, that really is integral to total development in the workforce too. So that's always been, like, I'd hate to say an avocation, but at times where I didn't have to work around the clock, these were the ways that were giving me my own kind of downtime and replenishing by the reading of the amalgam of those kinds of authors.
What's been the receptivity that you're experiencing when you present these kinds of ideas to corporate leaders who want to improve their performance?
Well, that's fascinating, because in the first step, you really have to make sure that people don't think, well, that has its own domain, that's a little ephemeral to me. But there are a couple of people that helped out in that. So for instance, there's more receptivity now when you can see increase in productivity by meditation and mindfulness that was introduced by Jon Kabat-Zinn 50 years ago. Then the linchpin to that was Daniel Goleman, when you were able to say that you could be an extremely bright leader and you could have all the experience, but there was a lot of research to support that many leaders weren't successful because they didn't have EQ or emotional intelligence. So people then begin to say, wow, 4 dimensions of emotional intelligence, great self-awareness, emotional control, ability to be empathetic to others, and interpersonal flexibility. We're beginning to realize, geez, the really, really good leaders had internalized those elements. So the receptivity came when there were bridge individuals like Goleman, who would interview the Dalai Lama, but at the same time be a viable consultant with a variety of his books like on EQ, that bridged the gap and enhanced the receptivity and made it palatable and acceptable to business CEOs to start with.
As you're talking about that, I keep seeing in my mind the book titled 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership.
Yes.
And how actively they have integrated so many different things about self-honesty and openness and right into their leadership training, and teaching people that if you want to actually be an effective leader, you have to embody these things.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because before, when you looked at leadership traits and attributes, a lot of them were things associated with sturdiness and discipline and fair and honest dealings. But then when we got to the issues, for instance, when we had the Great Recession, one of the hallmarks of a successful leader was transparency. Let me exactly tell you, you'll still have a job if you do this, and you might not if you don't do that, but I'm going to tell you what's behind the curtain. Then Brene Brown introduces concepts of vulnerability, your ability to say, you know what? I need help too, the leader says, which creates the bond with the worker to say, geez, we're all in this together. There's interconnectedness. So those what were initially viewed as soft and intangible skills now or attributes became the hallmark of success and integrated, which means that you can't have that if you don't embody some level of self-awareness. So the concept that I always try to use, because people need tangible analogies or metaphorical things or visuals. So I say, picture yourself in an interaction and you're both the actor in the play and the observer of the play. So simultaneously, I'm in it, but when I'm in it, it's hard for me to be removed. So can you remove yourself and also see how you're interacting in that interaction? So the kind of metaphor of be both in the situation and above the situation helps leaders know that they can't just plow through things, that they have to stop down to the pace and look at the whole situation. And I think that opens the door for receptivity, or what are skills and approaches and techniques you need to do to allow that awareness to unfold in a substantive way.
That whole thing about that awareness brings to mind the book Leadership and Self-Deception by the Arbinger Group and their Anatomy of Peace. This whole idea that our culture teaches us that our emotional state is created by what people outside of us do and events outside of us, whereas people who study this understand I create my emotions by how I choose to interpret and respond to events. It's an inside job. And if I don't have that awareness, if I keep charging out, trying to change people and things outside of me to change my internal state, that's difficult enough and unproductive enough if I'm an individual. But if I'm at the top of a leadership team, it's devastating.
I think that is a great insight of being able to take human behavior that's so complex and realize that it's also very straightforward and simple if you break it down. Like, for instance, and you and I have talked about this before, Michael Singer's new book on living untethered. You take the whole book down to 3 basic principles with 1 action step. There's only 3 things that exist in the world, an amalgam of experiences that are mostly neutral until we posit our own overlay on that. And our thoughts lead us to our emotions. And as you know, statistically, 80% or 85% of thoughts are either repetitive or negative by nature. So we have to actively engage in changing the equation. So the 4th dimension of that is choice. We have a choice to reframe those thoughts. We have a choice to explore those emotions. And by that, it gives us more control to know that as a leader or as an individual, we have more personal control on the outcome by how we reframe things than we think. And so getting rid of that victimization mode and realizing as a leader also the concept of mirror neurons. Obviously, that the people that we oversee or we interact with obviously mirror consciously or subconsciously the emotion and the approach that we bring to the table. So if we want to create anxiety and frenzy and disharmony, all we have to do is overtly demonstrate that.
Right.
And so conversely, if even in a state of crisis or difficulty, we have calm or sturdiness, subconsciously, the other person obviously starts to engage in it, even if they don't know why they're doing it, but because they're mirroring what we're exemplifying. And I think that's another level of awareness that has utility.
So as you're coaching, consulting, working with these various businesses and their leadership teams, what are some of the most effective tools that you use, that you teach them or ask them to get access to?
Well, let's start with the most basic thing that's probably the most difficult to do, as you would know, is that staying in the present moment. So that's step number 1. The past is done, so let's not ruminate about it. The future, why do we have worry and anxiety? Be present in this moment, because that's all there really is. So it allows you to have some level of awareness of what's going on. I think the second step is, and the tool could be like Tara Brach a lot of times talks about the brain process, which says, okay, leader, can you recognize what's going on? Could you allow it to unfold? Can you investigate why you're feeling and thinking that you are? And could you nurture it and let it flow through you so you can stay present and aware as much as possible right then? So that's one of the things. I also tell them about, a lot of people still feel uncomfortable with mindfulness word or meditation. Could you take pauses, even 5 minutes in the day, to walk outside, regroup, use the bathroom, I don't know, whatever, to try to always stay fresh and available as much as possible. So that's another level. And then for a leader, what I try to do, and this is another element, and let me just give you an overlay to this. I always talk about 8 foundational substantive things that you can bring to the table that makes you a substantive catalyst for change in your organization. And you would know these readily, but I always say there are 8, and you turn it on side, and it's a powerful number, but it also, if you turn it on side, it's like infinity. So it has that kind of marketing appeal. But the first is focus on the time for exercise. Number 2, make sure that you have the sleep you need. Number 3, the optimal levels of nutrition. 4, mindfulness meditation in some level. The other 5, 6, and 7, and 8 are interesting because it also talks about the issue of the importance of getting outside in nature, because that's a microcosm of life in some way. Making sure that you always have multifaceted, meaningful relationships that can further enhance your development because they don't bring you down when you have a choice. I also think the importance of being a lifelong learner and never being bored, and there's always something else to learn. So having the beginner's mind. And the 8th that brings it together is always having a feeling of gratitude. It's like saying thank you when the day starts, being appreciative, because a lot of the people that I deal with are very financially well off. They've gotten to the higher levels of success. So never taking that for granted. Remember where you started and be grateful for virtually anything. Now, there's a variety of other tools too, but I always start with those things that in the absence of those being integrated, you haven't enabled yourself to maximize your potential to use even skill-based techniques. So let me stop there for a second before I mention other things.
That's a great list of 8 things. And essentially, it's very, very close to what a functional medicine specialist might say is these are the things that are necessary for a healthy, fulfilling human life. If you expand what you said about relationships, you can encompass everything in the functional medicine list for a healthy, fulfilling human life, right? If you talk about love, connection to community, et cetera, in your relationship piece, the functional medicine people have studied this and say it's not rocket science. We know what it takes to have somebody feel good within themselves, feel comfortable in their own skin, have a rewarding or at least a contentment in life, a rewarding life. And it's almost everything that you just put in your list of 8.
Yes. And then what that does is, because people will say, well, yes, of course, but I view those as enablers to be able to deal with either as an employer or as an employee, the issues that you're dealt with, like crisis situations or difficult situations. How do you right size the fear? So many people get immobilized by fear, but how do you step back and say, okay, is that so? I've encountered that situation. I know what it's like viscerally. So how do I deal with that situation when the stock market goes down 25% and you go, oh my God, my knee-jerk response is to sell everything. Instead of right-sizing the fear and saying, life is cyclical in nature. It's always gone up and down. If I don't have a sphere of influence of 30 days, but if I have a sphere of influence of 30 months, then that is just the ebb before it goes up again. How do you Now, you wouldn't be able to do that if you don't use those foundational 8, because those allow you to be able to stay above the fray in some way. So that's kind of one of the elements. Or how do you then take a difficult situation and dilute it by asking a question? Like somebody says, that's a key person in my organization. I can't afford to lose that individual. And therefore you have knee-jerk responses to them, like you're concerned you might lose them. And then instead of asking the question, what are the wide variety of things that you need to do to make this such a nurturing environment? They'll never want to go because it's a destination. So turning the knee-jerk response of, I have to react, to a global question seems to dilute the magnitude of the angst. And so therefore it allows you to make more appropriate decisions.
Well, and that whole thing you're talking about, the word that comes to my mind is perspective. And if I can step back, if I get that broader view, the seat of the soul from Michael Singer, or that 30,000 foot perspective, if I have a thought like, oh my gosh, I can't afford to lose this person. Well, maybe I'm thinking that because they're so good at what they do. But maybe I'm thinking that because I see them as an integral part of the whole system working, but they really aren't performing very well, or they're causing personality ripples or drama and trauma in the workplace. And if I see it from, oh my God, I can't afford to lose them, there are no options, and I keep them in there. I'm thinking of Necessary Endings, the book Necessary Endings, right?
Yeah.
So if I can't say, well, look, this job, this life I have, this job I'm in, my business is bigger than any one person. And if one person is really, not willing to change to fit to help the whole system grow, then I need to end that, right? I need to end that relationship, or I need to end some aspect of that relationship with them. And so often in our world, if we have that myopic view you were talking about earlier, that very narrow field of view, I can't see any way to end that and keep everything moving. So I need to get that perspective and say, look, if I have those 8 pieces in place, I realize this life that I have that gratitude for is bigger than any one thing. And I don't define myself simply by the productivity of the company or the bottom line or my one relationship with this one person. And it gives me the flexibility to start looking at a variety of options. This field of view provides many more options for solutions than this field of view.
Well, you probably made the umbrella comment right there by that comment in terms of sense of perspective, because that is it's almost like a metaphor, the analogy would be, we can look at the trees or the rings of the trees, but if we got in a helicopter and looked at the entire panoramic view of the forest, we could say that myopic focus on that one issue is just an amalgam of all of these. And that perspective setting that you're saying dilutes the emotional knee-jerk reaction, doesn't make you act based on past tapes that were dysfunctional, and gives you a sense to say, hey, either this too will pass, or let's just look at that, or even from, I think, an insightful perspective of even momentary adversity is something that has utility, because it gives you a sense of perspective that will kind of add. Even Henry Ford goes back, fail your way into success, or all of those kinds of things, where even when you see, like, I remember it was the pediatrician and psychiatrist T. Barry Brazelton, who talked about touch points, who said all the times when you see children and all of a sudden they don't talk as fast or walk as fast or as ever, that he said that regression or slowing is sometimes a precursor to phenomenal growth. So therefore, don't look at myopically, oh my God, where I'm in a deficit situation. That could be building up all of that, or the child could be sitting there and internalizing and not saying anything. And all of a sudden they come out with polysyllabic words all over the place because they just internalized and not vocalized. And so why can't we look at that from that kind of perspective when we look at an employee who's not doing the things we want, or from a leader perspective to say, why don't you right-size the situation and therefore say that's a precursor to maybe phenomenal growth or productivity? So I think your word of perspective is really a great umbrella concept that really capsulizes a lot of what we've been talking about so far.
And so are there any specific ongoing assessment tools that you recommend for people, for individuals or for leaders to, like, there's the 1 Million Minds project that put this thing online where you can do a mental health check-in. And they encourage people to just come in here and fill this out. And then they'll give you a status check about all these various aspects of your life. How you're doing with your focus or your nutrition or your sleep or your mood regulation. Are there any tools like that you use or recommend for these leaders or their individuals?
There's a variety, actually. I use them also, teach as an adjunct faculty member at Notre Dame. I used to do it on a regular basis and now just in selective courses. But one of the things that I give them in an introductory session, as with leaders, because I think it has entry points for people in the beginning stages of their careers and later, is the 40 questions associated with the emotional IQ. So there would be, in each of those 4 areas that I mentioned, 10 behaviorally rated questions that is an entry point. So there'll be 10 questions associated with your ability to have good self-awareness, 10 on emotional control, 10 on your ability really to be empathetic in some way, and what kind of interpersonal flexibility do you have? So that's a tool that I use on a pretty regular basis as an entry point. And then other tools that I have personally developed talk about leadership and management, like your ability to give feedback and positive reinforcement and coaching and goal setting, because if you don't have the ability to know what goes into those and how people perceive you on a 360, then you're kind of missing the mark on that particular level. So some are very managerial and leadership specific, and other tools that I utilize are more in terms of making sure that you're aware of the dimensions that impact your emotional intelligence.
Wonderful. And of course, that is it's either an enabling factor or it's a constricting factor for my relationships at every level. If I can't tune into the flow, I was just having a conversation with somebody yesterday, and they were talking about how they tend to either hold everything in or overshare, and they can't find that middle ground. And we were talking about how, okay, so what's happening with you when you're either all clammed up and can't share anything, or you're pouring out too much information? It's always going to be a discomfort inside the person. And if they can't tap into that and dissipate that, then they can't connect with the other person and be in that flow that comes from the balance of the energy exchange, or what the other person might have as, their interest field. So
yes, I think that is critical. I mean, you're almost getting into the concept that's fascinating. It's harder to introduce this in the business world. It's almost like heart math, where instead of coming from your head, you're realizing in a lot of ways, the heart is almost like the thinking instrument. And if you're not in tune with that, some people refer this to, is it heartfelt, or your gut feeling, or intuition, or all of that, where a lot of people dismiss that. That's the central focus. I try to always bring into other things like this interesting. I'd be remiss because I almost view it as an indirect mentor. There's a gentleman who's, you would call him either a poet or someone highly spiritual or philosophical, Mark Nepo. He's got very well known, with the Super Soul Sundays with Oprah, and he has a recent book, Surviving the Storms, and he had Book of Awakening that was 20 years ago. But it's all about finding your way back to your authentic self. And so many different people are always telling you what you are and what you should be. Where do you find it as a leader or an individual, in the quiet of your own mind, of the cues you get to know what is your authentic self? Because presenting that has a concomitant value to everybody else, because it allows them to the freedom to want to divulge who they really are and want to do that more proactively. And so I try to bring in tools and techniques and approaches along those lines that are atypical to what you would see in the business world. So your business world life and your personal life are not disparate, but inextricably tied together in some way.
Excellent. I had this way I try to introduce people to that kind of a concept that you were just talking about, the authentic self and that balance. I put my hands out, palm up, and I say on my left hand, I'd like to tell you 3 things that might be true about you. I want you to observe this for yourself. I don't know you, right? But if you're like most human beings, you might have an intellectual side of your mind, the logical side, and the emotional side. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is if you're like most of us, you'll make your best decisions when you've got good access to both pools of information, because these parts of your mind are constantly interacting with the energy field and your past and your hopes for the future. And when you've got good access to both parts, you make your best decisions.
Yes.
The third thing is, if you're like most of us, if your emotional intensity, whether it's a positive or a negative emotion, is anywhere within the range from 0 to 10, from 0 to 5, maybe 6, your logic is still online and you have good access to both pools of information if you choose to tap into them. But if you get your emotional intensity, positive or negative, up to about a 6.5 or a 7 on that scale of 0 to 10, instantly your logical mind is now sitting in the back of the bus where it can't reach the wheel or the pedals. And the emotional intensity is making all the calls, despite the fact that you might be sitting back here watching saying, oh, this isn't going to go well. So if that is the case, and you observe that, I ask people, if that's true for you, what would be one of the most important skills you could learn? And they quickly say, how to calm down. And I say, well, that the problem is if you hit that 6.5 or a 7, if you get that triggered point, the part of you that would calm you down can't reach the pedals or the wheel, right? So it can't. Yes. So the skill to learn is to be in this mode where I'm observing myself more, day in and day out, every moment of the day, more and more moments of the day when I first begin. And when I notice myself rising in intensity from a level of 1 or 2 or 3 on that emotional scale, then my logic is still online. I activate some of the tools I've learned. I do the breath technique. I take the time out. I do the yoga pose, right? I do the 5-minute meditation you were talking about earlier. So I prevent myself from reaching that triggered point where I've lost this capacity to engage the tools I've learned, or that self-control, or that logical mind. And it's an oversimplification, but it's a nice way to get people introduced to all that stuff that Mark Nepo and others will say when you're talking about heart math and the deeper levels. This is a good intro for me with my clients.
And I think, Tim, that's a great example, because the most difficult thing always is to take something, as you're indicating, from the conceptual level where people nod and say, okay, how do I put that into practice? Like you just gave a very good example of a key attribute of how do I engage in regular, during the course of the day, observation of me while I'm leading my life, so I can know how I'm being buffeted around or not, and what's impacting me and how it's affecting me viscerally, and what thoughts are coming into my mind that I put there versus automatic thoughts, and how do I reframe them. And I think that's a great example of that, and how you bring yourself, back to that observation in the fray of the daily thing. And the one other thing that I try to look at, and this is harder a point to land, but some people who are moving along this path are appreciative of it. I look how you're making progress if you've been able to quiet yourself enough to recognize synchronistic events that are happening for you that you wouldn't be aware of if you didn't slow down to be open of that. It's like the most pedestrian example is you're thinking of someone and they call you. Well, of course, that's an extreme version of that. But what about, like I had one the other day where I didn't know something about somebody, that I've known for 30 or 40 years, and I opened and he had passed away, and I see an article in a magazine, and 3 pages later was something about him. But if I didn't read that previous article, I wouldn't have gotten to that. And when I got to it, I learned a wide variety of things that set many things into place. Well, slowing down to read that and to be appreciative of that led me to something else. I view that as a synchronistic event because I slowed down my pace of living and I was reinforced kind of by the universe that led me 3 pages later that made something totally else unfolded that gave me insight into another person. I write those things down. Here's another example of that. That tells me I must be on the right path because I've slowed down to the pace of where I'm at the moment for that to unfold, to appreciate, and to acknowledge it. So synchronistic events that you're aware of and you write down or do something gives you a benchmark that you're maybe starting to employ some of the things we've been chatting about.
Right. And you can get into that mindfulness state. You can get an increased awareness of what's happening in your energy field with thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations. And if you've been introduced to the concept that much of that is internally created, and then you can have some tools to start to work with it. So we have the self-calming, we have the shifting of focus, we have the canceling of goals, we have the reorganizing of priorities, all of these different tools done with breath work, right? Done with here, I can take control of my breathing right now. Well, if I focus on things I don't have any control over, I start to feel more and more agitated and more out of control. As soon as I shift my focus over to things I have control over, I feel better. Well, in any moment, what might I have control over? My breathing. I don't always have control of the focus of my thoughts because things might be happening so rapidly and people might be demanding my attention. But I can take a breath and I can get this energy system back into that parasympathetic response rather than that stress response or fight or flight response. So it's those simple things that I can practice. And that married with the idea that I'm actually questioning, has my culture been honest with me when it tells me you make me angry, you hurt my feelings, you're scaring me? Or is that an inside job? And can I learn how to step into that that voluntary control of my thought process, which has a calming effect? And then, as we talked about before, opens my field of view and provides me with, nearly an infinite range of options compared to what it was when I was emotionally excited or stressed or raging.
Well, 2 things, and this is fascinating because I think you got back to the issue of perspective again, and it's interesting because I've over the time I've written 2 quote books, but they're quotes from people that I admire, but they told me things. One was called Become Who You Are, and the other book was called Coming Home. Both kind of saying you go through your whole life to get back where you were. But the first quote in the second quote book, Einstein's quote I put in there was, the first decision you have to make is if you live in a hostile or a friendly universe. Because if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.
Yes.
Which is like a double entendre, a double meaning that I will look at the same things differently, or I'll start to look at different things. And to me, without all the things that we have been talking about, I don't know how you ever really fully embrace all aspects of the serenity prayer without this, because being type A oriented business leaders, to accept the things I cannot change, well, what could those possibly be? And to have the courage to change the things I can, all right. But that wisdom to know the difference, therein lies the kind of Shakespearean rub, because without all the things we're talking about, what's your sorting mechanism to know the difference of the things we can't change or change? That's an ongoing struggle. And to me, that's where the beauty of that prayer comes from, because with all of these tools, techniques, and mindsets, how do you equip yourself in the quiet of your mind to have the wisdom to know the difference where you affect change versus you let life unfold, because that's the nature of life. Is go with Zen, is that so when something happens, as opposed to try and evoke a change. That delicate balance to me is a lifelong challenge.
Yeah, that's excellent. And to me, it's just resonating that question with a nice deep breath, and I hold it at the top and I slow the exhale and I ask myself, okay, what am I making this situation mean?
Yes.
Because it only has the meaning for me that I give it, which is why some people can stay calm in the midst of a crowd that's, erupting in either anger or fear. And some people can stay calm and focused. It's because they're making this moment, this situation mean something different. And that, just as I said that, it brings up the poem If by Rudyard Kipling, which has so many excellent lines in it.
Yes.
It begins with keeping your head when others about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. But one of my favorite lines in it is, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. Because I used to tell people, I would write this in one of the exercises I would give people as an option that they could choose as an observation for themselves. My successes and failures in any area do not increase or decrease my value as a person. And that comes right from that line in Rudyard Kipling's poem. If I can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same, realize that's not me, right? This is just an event in time. This is this interaction with the environment. It's not my essence. And so that's just what came to mind.
Well, it's fascinating. I think we have so many similarities. If I took you downstairs to one of my rooms, I have something on the wall. And I used to read a lot of, in my earlier years, Carlos Castaneda books, who was a cultural anthropologist, and about the Yaqui way of knowledge and Don Juan. And the high esteemed person was the warrior, male or female. And his favorite quote, very similar to yours, is the average person in life sees everything as either a blessing or a curse, and the warrior sees everything as a challenge, which is analogous to what you're saying is, can you deal with both adversity and great things and treat them on the same ends, like the fulcrum in the middle and going back and forth, and that's how life goes. And I think that's the insight that goes back to your comment of having a sense of perspective.
That reminds me of the story of the three umpires they had a long day of calling games, and they were meeting at a bar for some drinks afterwards. And the one says, well, there's balls and there's strikes, and I call them as they are. And the second one goes, well, there's balls and strikes, and I call them as I see them. And the third one goes, well, there's only pitches until I call them.
That's it. That's a good insight. That really is. And
the other one that came to mind was when I was in high school. I was a senior in high school. I was asked to make a banner for the religion class, and it got me a D or an F. I don't know, because I was so clueless at the time, but I was into reading Native American anthologies. And the saying that I chose for the banner was, I seek strength, not to be better than my brother, but to fight my greatest enemy, myself.
That's it. That is it. That's the whole aspect of life always unfolding, and why you look at that and you say, how could someone ever feel bored? Because you have a lifelong pursuit of wanting to make more incremental personal development insights and improvements, I think, and then and as you look at it from a global perspective, every time you do that individually, it resonates with other people around you. So your personal growth has a concomitant positive impact on other people, I believe.
Excellent. Well, I realize that we're getting close on time here. I wonder if you could just take a moment or two and get centered and think, okay, so if we're going to wrap up this interview, what's something about your work or about, personal development or any aspect of your life teaching that you would like to share that we haven't even touched on yet?
And because I haven't necessarily thought through that, but I would want to reinforce this point, to always be open to ways of redefining or reinventing yourself, or never pigeonhole yourself in terms of what you think you need to be or what you are based upon the input of other individuals. And that the best thing that you can do whenever progress you make is to sit down in the quiet of your own mind, or find a quiet place and do a personal stock of what comes to you and say, where do I want to go from there? I think most of the time, a lot of our lives are in reaction to other people's expectations of us, acknowledgments of us, or giving us input of where we need to go. And I think in the quiet of our own minds, and actually this is kind of interesting about that, my mother was very, very effective of always trying to enhance my vocabulary since an early age. And I remember a lot of times, even though she could be critical at some levels, a thing that always resonated with me was the little quote from Hamlet of, "To thine own self be true." And I think that probably resonates more with me, that has applicability to everybody, of find your own self and know happiness is defined as when your thoughts and your actions and what you say all seem to be consonant with one another. That's where it is. So when those are consonant, what you think and what you say and what you do seem to all be consonant, then I believe then you found some authentic self, and to thine own self have been true.
Wonderful.
That's the best I could do off the top of my head.
Plenty good. Well, I thank you so much for joining us and helping this project along. And I'm going to look into those books of quotes that you mentioned. And I look forward to our next contact. I greatly appreciate your sharing with us.
Well, thank you, Tim. And I applaud, as I started out, with all the fine work that you do to help other individuals move along their paths of life wherever they are. So you should be applauded for initiating this and having a deep passion for what you do.
Thank you so much. Jeff Sucec is principal and co-founder of Performance Potential Incorporated. He has over 40 years' experience working with a wide range of organizations, helping them move to the next level of performance. He's a thought leader in the alignment of business goals and strategy to employee productivity. Jeff is often the highest-rated keynote speaker at business conferences. The topics he covers includes leadership, employee engagement, using innovative approaches for maximizing performance, identifying and migrating best practices, creating a culture of creativity and innovation, and implementing client-focused sales cultures. He's a published writer in organizational behavior, performance improvement, and sales management effectiveness. Prior to co-founding Performance Potential, Jeff was a founder and CEO of FTR, a premier business performance consulting firm, serving financial services clients worldwide. Jeff brings a unique perspective to clients as a business owner who has been through all the stages of a company's life, from its founding through the various phases of growth and ultimate sale to a $3 billion private equity company. For over 20 years, Jeff has been an accomplished executive coach for both business owners and influential corporate owners. Jeff Sucec has served as an adjunct professor at the University of Notre Dame since 2001, where his progressive business courses have always been rated the highest in his department and near the top for the overall university. He received a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Notre Dame and an MBA from the University of Illinois. He founded the JJS Foundation to help underprivileged children reach their full potential.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.